FIFA calls the 2026 World Cup the biggest tournament in football history. 104 matches, 48 national teams, 3 host nations. And on paper, this is supposed to be America's World Cup. The United States will host the most matches. The United States will host the final. The United States sits at the center of the entire project. But something interesting is happening. As kickoff gets closer, global attention seems to be shifting somewhere else. The opening match will take place in Mexico. Canada is preparing for the biggest moment in its football history. Meanwhile, in the United States, more and more conversations are emerging about ticket prices, stadium atmosphere, and whether ordinary fans will truly be part of this tournament. At first glance, these seem like completely separate stories. A stadium in Mexico, a city in Canada, a debate in the United States. But look a little closer, and they all lead to the same question. Will the 2026 World Cup really belong to the United States? Or have Mexico and Canada already captured the most important part of any World Cup before the tournament has even begun? The attention of the fans. Because the World Cup has never been remembered only for where the final was played. It is remembered for the places that created unforgettable moments, the cities that embraced the tournament, the crowds that filled the streets, the atmosphere that made the world stop and watch. And right now, some of the strongest World Cup stories are unfolding far beyond the stadium that will host the final. Before we continue, let me know what you think in the comments. What makes a World Cup truly unforgettable? The biggest stadiums? Or the emotions created by the fans? Because this story may not be unfolding the way FIFA originally expected. If there is one place that best illustrates this shift in attention, it is Mexico City. Because when the 2026 World Cup officially begins, billions of people will not be looking toward New York. They will not be looking toward Los Angeles. And they will not be looking toward Dallas. They will be looking toward Estadio Azteca. And that is what makes this story so interesting. At first glance, Azteca is simply a football stadium. But look a little closer, and it feels more like a living piece of World Cup history. In 1970, it witnessed Pelé's Brazil lift the World Cup trophy. In 1986, it witnessed Diego Maradona score 2 of the most famous goals in football history. The hand of God and the goal of the century. Now, nearly 40 years later, Azteca is once again preparing to become the center of the football world. When FIFA confirmed that Mexico would host the opening match of the 2026 World Cup, something quietly changed. Subtle, but significant. Because a World Cup does not begin with a final. It begins with an image, a feeling, a moment that the world remembers. And this time, that moment belongs to Mexico. But there is another layer to the story. Mexico will not only host the opening match. The Mexican national team will also play its group stage matches at home. That means tens of thousands of supporters will have the chance to turn every match into a football celebration. People who have experienced Azteca often describe the same things. The noise, the pressure, the energy, the feeling that the entire stadium is living every second of the match. That is something money cannot simply buy. For years, the United States has been viewed as the center of the 2026 World Cup project. More matches, more stadiums, more revenue. But before the tournament has even started, Mexico already possesses something far more difficult to acquire: history, emotion, and the attention of the football world. At first, that may not seem important. After all, the United States still hosts the final. The United States still hosts most of the tournament. But if World Cup history has taught us anything, it is this: fans remember moments, not numbers. And that leads to another question. If Mexico owns the opening moment of the World Cup, then who will capture the hearts of the fans? The answer may be found in another country. A country hosting only 13 matches, yet preparing for the biggest football moment in its history. That country is Canada. If Mexico possesses history, Canada possesses something entirely different. A sense of freshness, a sense of excitement, and the feeling that something special is about to happen. On the 12th of June 2026, Canada will host the first Men's World Cup match in its history. At first glance, that may not sound like a huge deal, but for Canadian football fans, it is a moment they have been waiting for across generations. This is not simply another match. It is the first time the World Cup truly arrives on their doorstep. And that is where the story becomes even more interesting. While Mexico is attracting attention through history, Canada is doing it in a completely different way. Toronto is preparing to welcome the world, not through legendary stories that stretch back decades, but through experience. Toronto is one of the most multicultural cities in North America. Supporters from dozens of different countries can find a community there, and that creates a unique atmosphere. Because the World Cup has never been only about football. It is about crowded public squares, flags filling the streets, conversations between people who have never met before, and the feeling that the entire world has gathered in one place. But look a little closer. Canada's advantage may not be emotional alone. For many international visitors, Canada is viewed as a more accessible destination. Fewer barriers, fewer concerns, and a simpler travel experience. That perception is making Toronto an increasingly attractive choice for many neutral supporters. So while Mexico offers history, Canada offers hospitality. And that is not what many people expected when the 2026 World Cup was announced years ago. On paper, the United States remains the center of the tournament. But little by little, Mexico and Canada are creating the stories that seem to capture the most attention. And that is where a bigger question begins to emerge. If Mexico has history, if Canada has atmosphere, then what does the United States have that can keep it at the center of World Cup 2026? The answer should be simple. But once we look at what has been happening with ticket prices in the United States, the picture becomes far more complicated. And that is where the story begins to change direction. Because if there is one thing the United States was expected to do better than anyone else, it was attracting crowds, bigger stadiums, more advanced infrastructure, more matches. On paper, every advantage seemed to belong to the United States. But something unexpected happened. One of the biggest debates surrounding the 2026 World Cup is not really about football. It is about ticket prices. Consider the opening match of the United States national team. This should be one of the most sought-after games of the entire tournament. The host nation, one of the most modern stadiums in the world. The opening chapter of America's World Cup journey. Yet, instead of talking about the atmosphere, many fans have been talking about something else. The cost. Ticket prices for some matches have sparked intense discussions across social media. And that is where a paradox begins to emerge. The World Cup was expanded to include more people, more teams, more matches, more countries. But some supporters feel that actually attending the tournament may be becoming more difficult. At first glance, this looks like a simple business story. Supply and demand. Nothing more. But look a little closer, and it may reflect a much bigger question. Who is the World Cup really being built for? Ordinary supporters, or those who can afford to pay the most? And that is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Mexico is selling history. Canada is selling experience. The United States seems to be selling scale. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. But the World Cup has never been just another sporting event. It is football's greatest global festival. A place where supporters from every corner of the world come together. A place where the emotion in the stands can sometimes matter as much as the action on the pitch. And that is what makes this conversation so important. Because if the stadiums are not full, if the atmosphere does not match expectations, if the first images broadcast around the world fail to capture the passion people associate with the World Cup, then how much does the advantage of hosting more matches really matter? And once that question appears, a much larger picture begins to emerge. At first glance, Mexico, Canada, and the United States seem to be telling three different stories. But in reality, all three stories may be leading toward the same central issue surrounding World Cup 2026. An issue that has very little to do with football itself, and everything to do with what the World Cup truly represents. But what makes this story particularly interesting is that this question is not being asked only in the United States. It is being asked in many parts of the world, because as the World Cup becomes bigger, the debate surrounding it seems to be growing as well. More teams, more stadiums, more sponsors, more revenue. At first glance, those all sound like signs of success. But look a little closer, and another question begins to emerge. Is the World Cup becoming a bigger global event? Or is it becoming a bigger global product? And that is where all the pieces of this story start to connect. Mexico is not attracting attention because it hosts the most matches. Canada is not attracting attention because it has the most stadiums. And even the ticket price debates in the United States are not really just about money. At their core, all of these conversations revolve around something much more powerful: emotion. Fans want to feel like they are part of the World Cup. They want to feel that the tournament was built for them. They want to believe that this is still football's greatest celebration. And that is where the bigger picture finally comes into focus. At first glance, Mexico, Canada, and the United States appear to be telling completely different stories. But perhaps they are all telling the same one. Mexico represents history. Canada represents the fan experience. The United States represents the scale of the modern World Cup. Three countries, three narratives. One question: who does the 2026 World Cup really belong to? The host nations? FIFA? Or the supporters who have given the tournament its meaning across generations? And that may be the most fascinating debate of all. Because the biggest question before World Cup 2026 is not who will lift the trophy. It is what the World Cup itself is becoming. And the answer may only reveal itself once the tournament finally begins. And that is where all the pieces of the story finally begin to come together. Take a step back and look at everything we have just seen. Mexico is capturing global attention through the opening match at Azteca. Canada is preparing for the first men's World Cup moment in its history. The United States is facing growing debates about ticket prices, stadium atmosphere, and the overall fan experience. At first glance, these seem like three completely separate stories. Three countries, three different situations, three different headlines. But look a little closer. They all revolve around the same question. Who is truly at the center of World Cup 2026? Because this is no longer simply a comparison between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In many ways, it has become a comparison between two different versions of the World Cup itself. On one side stands the modern World Cup. Bigger, more matches, more revenue, more commercial value. On the other side stands the World Cup that generations of fans fell in love with. Packed stadiums, cities living and breathing football, moments that allow the entire world to share the same emotion. That is why Mexico matters. That is why Canada has captured so much attention. And that is why the debates taking place in the United States have become so important. Because in the end, fans do not remember a World Cup because of the number of matches. They remember the moments. They remember the atmosphere. They remember how the tournament made them feel. And that is what makes this story so fascinating. The United States can still create those moments. The United States still hosts the final. The United States still has the biggest stadiums. The United States still controls most of the tournament. But before a single ball has been kicked, Mexico and Canada have already sparked a conversation that FIFA may never have expected. A conversation about the soul of the World Cup. And that may be the most important story of all. Because World Cup 2026 may become the biggest tournament in football history. Yet the question many people are asking is not how big it will be. The question is who it is ultimately being built for. And that may be the question that shapes the future of the World Cup for years to come.